I'm Brent Jensen, and welcome to episode 2, the 1960s, of The Sound of a Dry Martini, remembering Paul Desmond. This is made possible by the Manieri Jazz and Swing Endowment. That song you just heard was Desmond Blue by Paul Desmond. It's a minor blues that was written to be featured on the album Desmond Blue, which was Paul Desmond with strings. There were some string arrangements that were on that particular one, very lush string arrangement. We didn't have the whole string section. That was just a quartet version with Jamie Finley on guitar, Chris Seimer on bass, and John Bishop on drums, and myself on alto saxophone. And this, in the 1960s, the Dave Brubeck Quartet really starts to pick up some steam. Of course, 1959 is when the album Time Out was recorded, and Take 5 was featured on that particular album. But during this period, Paul is also making recordings as a leader for RCA, for the label RCA, and mostly with the guitarist Jim Hall. Supposedly, according to the stories, Paul and Dave Brubeck had a gentleman's agreement that if he did recordings on his own, he would not use a pianist, which he never did, to my knowledge. It was always a guitar player. There was a couple different guitar players that he recorded with, or he recorded in these kind of big, lush string or horn kind of environments, or with an arranger that was arranging this stuff. So it definitely differentiated it from being the Dave Brubeck Quartet. From 1959 through 1966, so most of them into the mid-60s, there were recordings that he did with Jim Hall. There's a series called the Complete RCA Recordings. It's a little box set with all of the records. It's been released by both RCA, and there's also Mosaic Records, who they release all sorts of archival recordings or lost recordings that are, remastered and released. We'll talk about one later in the 70s that Paul's involved with. But the one that I got was from RCA, but Mosaic has also done it with, I think, all of the outtakes, so all of the incomplete takes as well. But the picture you're seeing is from the RCA recordings. The other person that Paul recorded quite a bit with during this same period, he started kind of in the mid-50s, 1954, and went through 62, was baritone saxophonist Jerry Mulligan. Those are some of my favorite recordings of Paul Desmond's, because it's a very spare instrumentation. You just have the bass player, the drummer, and the two saxophones. So there was a lot made about the counterpoint and the kind of contrapuntal ways that their lines, they would solo at the same time. And you don't get that kind of thing in the bebop era. It's usually one soloist at a time. But with the so-called cool school or West Coast players, Jerry Mulligan's quartet with the trumpet player Chet Baker, definitely they made allusions to the music of Bach. Sounded like Bach two-part inventions. And there's actually there's a website, there's the YouTube site by a group that calls themselves Sharp 11 Music. And if you just go to youtube.com/sharp11music, it will take you to that site, and there's a lot of videos on there. But you will find a couple videos on Paul Desmond. There's actually 4 or 5 videos, but one is titled How Paul Desmond Improvised Counterpoint Like J.S. Bach. And the guy, it gets a little nerdy, gets a little music theory oriented, but he talks about the things that Paul Desmond is doing, and sometimes how he's lifting quotes directly from Bach's music or some classical sources. It made Paul Desmond's sound quite a bit different than the other jazz players. He really had very little of the Charlie Parker kind of vocabulary in his playing. Like most of the players that came up in the mid-40s into the 50s were all trying to sound like Charlie Parker. He was very definitely not sounding like Charlie Parker, both in his sound and also in the type of ideas that he played. So it's worth taking a look at that YouTube site of the Sharp 11 Music, because there's a couple videos that get into kind of the analysis of what he's doing in his playing. And that's very prominent on the recordings, particularly one of them called Two of a Mind, Paul Desmond and Jerry Mulligan Quartet. And they were very loosely put together sessions where they just called some tunes. There were probably a few arrangements on there, but several of them they're just improvising. They're just improvising on the chord changes of a tune like T for Two. which I think is Two of a Mind, I think is the one that's based on that one. There's one called Battle Hymn of the Republican, and that one they're just improvising on another. There's one that's Look for the Silver Lining, and a couple other jazz standard tunes, but they never play the melody of those tunes. They just improvise, and they weave back and forth. You'll hear them soloing individually, but then together. And he does that with almost everybody he plays with. He did it with Dave Brubeck quite a bit, especially early on in the early recordings. A little less so as the quartet started to become really popular and were touring the world and had the Time Out hit with that particular album. But he does it with Jim Hall on the Jim Hall recordings as well. And so definitely a part of Paul Desmond's playing that you don't see with some other musicians or some other styles is this kind of almost classical approach to counterpoint and playing together. The Dave Brubeck Quartet, as we know it, usually when people are referring to the Dave Brubeck Quartet, they're referring to the one that had Joe Morello playing drums and Eugene Wright playing bass. And that is the group that made the recording Time Out in 1959, which was a great year for jazz recordings. There was a bunch of jazz recordings that came out that same time, Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. There was 5 or 6 historically really important albums, and Time Out with the Dave Brubeck Quartet was one of them, and it featured Take 5, also Blue Rondo a la Turk. I believe they released that as a 45, a little single, and on one side was Take 5, and the other side was Blue Rondo a la Turk. But this picture that you're seeing here is the publicity shot of the Dave Brubeck Quartet, as we know it, with Morello and Eugene Wright, Dave Brubeck, and Paul Desmond. There's also the song Take 5, which I'll mention that more in the next episode. The Take 5 becomes very popular. You get all sorts of different versions of it for almost every instrument. Here's a picture of the sheet music from Take 5 for piano. There's a piano arrangement. And everybody was learning this tune and trying to figure out how to play this tune on piano, on ukulele, on whatever. There's marching band arrangements of it. And it served Paul quite well because he received royalties for this song well after its release. It was a tune that actually was collaborated between Dave Brubeck and Paul Desmond. Paul brought in a couple different tunes that were written in 5/4 time. So you have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, quite different than the duple times doing 4s and 2s. And Dave suggested, why don't you put these 2 tunes together? And so the 2 parts that you hear of Take 5 were actually 2 separate tunes that he combined to create a full song form, what we call in music an AABA kind of form. So you've got that kind of, but unlike Miles Davis, who liked to take responsibility for edits and changes, Dave Brubeck did not, and he gave sole ownership of that particular tune to Paul Desmond. And the quartet continues to travel all around the world, making all sorts of live recordings and stuff, and occupies most of Paul Desmond's time during the 60s. But as I mentioned, it's really worth checking out these other recordings that he did with Jim Hall. There's probably 4 or 5 recordings he did, a couple that he did with Jerry Mulligan, so that you're getting a different take. It actually features him soloing quite a bit more than he was allowed the solo time that he had in the quartet. And quite different than playing these odd time signature things that came out from Time Out and its subsequent albums, Time Further Out, I think Time in Outer Space. There was a series. They tried to kind of capitalize on the popularity of the Time Out album. But the quartet disbands in 1967. Desmond quits playing for quite a few, for about 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years, where he just decides he wants to entertain the idea of maybe being a writer. And he is a very good writer. He said he was writing a book that was based on his experiences and travels with the quartet called How Many of You Are There in the Quartet? That was a frequently asked question, he said, by airline stewardesses. How many of you are there in the quartet? He found that amusing. And he only got as far as one short article, which was featured in Punch magazine, which I looked all over the internet for. And fortunately, just recently, there's a guy named Steve Serra, C-E-R-R-A, and he has a great blog that he does, where he puts all sorts of, and he seems to be a fan of Paul Desmond, and also Dave Brubeck and Jerry Mulligan. A bunch of the cool jazz musicians are featured on his blog. It's profiles.blogspot.com, and Steve Serra is the guy that kind of runs this. I believe he's a drummer. He's a jazz drummer. And if you go to that blog spot and just type into, there's a search engine in there, you could type in Paul Desmond, and there'll be several articles that will come up on Paul Desmond. You could even do Paul Desmond Punch article, because there was a magazine, I believe it was a British humor magazine called Punch, and they published this this short story that he wrote about a very amusing, probably amusing to other people, not so much to musicians, because it's very indicative of stuff that musicians have had to endure. But they were playing at the Orange County Fair in upstate New York, in Orange County, and it's his experiences with that particular day as they went in to play, and it's quite funny. His liner notes are also really good, very witty, very funny as well, and you can find those. I believe Steve Serra has posted most of those, so if you go to that blog spot, you'll find numerous entries for Paul Desmond. At the middle of the 1960s or so, there was a huge bossa nova craze as jazz merged with the music from Brazil. And of course, Stan Getz and the Getz João Gilberto Getz and Charlie Bird, the albums, the Girl from Ipanema in 1964, actually won a Grammy Award for Album of the Year. And so Paul kind of hopped on that bandwagon, and he had an album called Bossa Antigua in 1965, which Bossa Nova translates roughly to new beat or new wave, and of course Bossa Antigua would be old beat, old wave, so he was, again, trying to be a little sarcastic, I guess, about it. But the Bossa Antigua album is all bossa novas, quite a few original compositions by Paul, and we'll close this episode with a performance of us, again, with Jamie Finley on guitar, Chris Seimer on bass, and John Bishop on drums, performing Bossa Antigua.